Leslie Clarkson was born in London in 1933, and for the best part of the previous century his family had been engaged in building barges on the River Thames. Leslie, with that sort of a background, and born in 1933 at the depth of the Depression, with your formative years to be spent under the shadow of World War II, it sparked the thought in my mind that a career in economic history was not much of a rational economic choice. And I wondered therefore if you might begin by saying something to us about what it was that sparked your interest in history.
Well, it wasn't a rational choice, but I'm not sure anything I've ever done in my life has been rational. What sparked my interest in history? Well, perhaps I better go back to 1944, and you'll remember, since you're a social historian, that the Battle of Education Act came in 1944, and that introduced the 11+ examination. And for my generation of working class children, this was the way out of the working classes. And we forget now, I think, that the 11+ was seen as a great social revolution and a great improvement. So I passed this wretched examination, I think largely by the courtesy of Hermann Göring, because the 11+ exam in London where I sat it was held during an air raid. At least half the candidates didn't turn up. Now what happened to them I don't know, but of those that did, I managed to pass. The other thing about the Battle Act you might remember was that it created 3 tiers of schools. There was what became the secondary modern, the grammar schools, and then technical schools, which were meant to equip people for the modern world. And my parents, my mother, I suppose, really, because she was the forceful one in the whole enterprise, decided that I should go to one of these technical schools. Before we could do that, actually, we moved quickly from London to escape the flying bombs. In fact, I started my grammar school career in Bridlington High School, which is a very traditional kind of grammar school. But when we came back to London, I went to my first choice school, where I had a largely scientific education, some of which I enjoyed. I enjoyed the physics and the chemistry. I didn't enjoy the technical education whatsoever. I still think the most boring thing I've ever done in my life is 6 lessons of woodwork, followed the next day by 6 lessons of metalwork. But just squeezed in among all this were 2 periods of history a week, but also 6 periods of English. And it was the English and the history which stimulated my interest. And so during the course of my school career, I simply became interested in the humanities, and particularly the history, I think, because I had a very good history teacher. I can still remember him now, who was obviously totally frustrated by this syllabus. And at the age of 16, there was no sixth form in my school, and what one usually did, even with the 11+ boys, was to go into an apprenticeship of some sort, and that broadly is what my school was designed for. But I didn't want to do that. I wanted to do history, but I had no Latin because that wasn't part of the Brave New World. But my history master said, well, there is a way around it. You can go to, you can do economic history at the local technical college, which happened to be the same building. But if you do economic history, you might be able to get into London, do the London Intermediate BSc Econ, and get into history that way. So that's what I did. Sparking an interest? I don't know, it just sort of, like Topsy. No, that's not right. It grew anyway. It just grew.
And the economic history, because you didn't have the Latin, as you said.
Yeah, I drifted into, I took economic history as the back route into history, because in those days Latin was a requirement for straightforward history courses. But I never regretted it, because I was fortunate in the technical college that I went to. The teaching was pretty ropey, but had got a good library, and there were the old classics. Clapham, 1, 2, 3 volumes, big ones. Ashton's little book on the Industrial Revolution was published a year before I got my school certificate. You know, and if you've got Ashton and you've got Clapham, you can't really go wrong. You can't really go wrong. And Rostow, you know, the 1948 volume, not all the takeoff rubbish, but sorry, not all the takeoff stuff, but you know, the industrial fluctuations. So there you are.
Yeah, well, we might come back to Rostow and some of his collaborators, but so you go to university, you opt for Nottingham. Was that because of the economic historians there?
I had no idea who they were. Now, I had a friend in the technical college who had a brother at Nottingham, and he thought Nottingham was a good place, so I applied there. The alternative, you see, was to go to the LSE. And I could have done that. I was accepted by the LSE after my intermediate course, but that meant travelling up from home. I didn't want to do that. You know, if you're 17 or 18, I mean, who wants to live at home and go to university? So I thought Nottingham was sufficiently far away, and I applied to Nottingham. I had no idea that David Chambers was there, you know, but somebody was obviously looking after my interests.
Indeed. So inspired by your brother's friend rather than the Times Guide to good universities.
There were no such things in those days.
Indeed, indeed. So you get to Nottingham and, of course, Chambers is there.
Yes.
What was your impression of Chambers?
Perhaps I should step back one, because the first economic historian I met at Nottingham was not Chambers, but Eric Kerridge. Eric was a very intense scholar, extremely intense. He's also, I met him about 20 years ago at a conference, and I reminded him that he had taught me, "Oh, my dear fellow," he said, "I'm so sorry." He was the most awful, awful lecturer you could ever possibly wish to meet. He was so bad in a way that he inspired you. You know, there must be something about the subject to make a man so dedicated and so uninterested in making it palatable. So my first experience at Nottingham Economic History was a huge diet on the origin of the open field system. And it was only a bit later that I met David Chambers. But, well, you know, he was small, bristly. Did you ever meet him?
No.
So you never heard his the first Tourney lecture in 1970. He lectured at a breathtaking speed, enormously energetic, enormously enthusiastic, great regional historian. I mean, he'd written a book on history of Nottingham, 1932, I think. But also he had written a book which he never mentioned, and it's very difficult to find now, on revolutions. And that was an indication of his other interest. He had a very wide interest, but it was hidden under this kind of rather bucolic approach, very regional approach. We learnt a lot about Nottingham, a lot about enclosures, a lot about labour supply, and he was just very, very inspiring. And he produced an awful lot of future academics.
I mean, I was born in Nottingham, and I remember as a schoolboy being told about the open field system. Was it at Laxton?
Yes.
Did you get traipsed out to that as part of the course?
He tried to get the university to buy it. When it came on the market in about 1952 or 53, it was the last fully fledged open field system in England, I think. And he tried to persuade the university to buy it. But they didn't. And it's probably not open anymore.
I wouldn't think so. I'm sure it's been redeveloped. So you finish at Nottingham and you decide to do a PhD, or you win a scholarship to do a PhD?
No, I didn't. I decided to do and didn't win a scholarship. I was fortunate. Remember, we're talking about the prehistoric days. This is before the Anderson Committee. before mandatory grants. And if I hadn't been a schoolboy in Essex, I would have never got to university. But on the basis of my intermediate BSc Econ from London, Essex County Council gave me a bursary to go to university. Now, if I'd lived in Kent, no bursaries, because Kent didn't do things like that. The only way you could get to university with somebody else paying in the late 50s, in the early 50s, was either to get a bursary, to get a university scholarship, or to get one of the 100 state scholarships which were available for the whole country. So I went there courtesy of the Essex County Council. When I finished in 1954, I wanted to do research. Again, there were no normal postgraduate awards. There were a few university awards. I didn't get one of those, but again, Essex County Council turned up trumps, and they gave me a grant to do research. It wasn't a very big one, but you know.
It was enough.
God bless Essex County Council.
There are not many people who still say that, I wouldn't think. So you chose to work on the leather industry, I think. I mean, what determined that?
F.J. Fisher. I'd come, Jack Fisher at the LSE, I'd come across him as an undergraduate, because in my second and third years, as well as David Chambers and Eric Kerridge. Kerridge was replaced by Robert Ashton, at the end of my first year, and Ashton had been a pupil of Tawney and of Jack Fisher. And so, you know, he led me into the world of, first of all, Tawney. Diet of Tawney's Tudor economic documents, Tawney and Power, Tudor economic documents, which I still have. And he got me interested in the early modern world. I think I would have liked to have been a medievalist, really, like you once, but I didn't have the Latin. So but the early modern world, and then through that, Jack Fisher. And I got to know Jack Fisher while I was an undergraduate, not very well, but he used to come to Nottingham quite a bit. And indeed, he was my external examiner when I graduated. And we had those things in those days. And he suggested the leather industry on the grounds that nobody had ever done it before. You might remember, this was 1954. And the big issue in early modern economic history was the rise of the gentry. And a lot of graduate students were doing the county gentries, Kent or Norfolk or Nottingham. You know, I thought, being fairly unoriginal, I'd do Essex, but he said there's no future in the gentry. Do the leather industry, he said nobody's ever done it, and there's an awful lot of leather around. So that's how it came. Rosalind complained to him once about, why did you get him to do something as smelly as... He said it could have been worse, it could have been sewage. So I started the leather industry, supervised by Bob Ashton. But I just got married, and we were living in London at the time. Nottingham protested about that, but David Chambers said, if you keep all your history research students in Nottingham, you'll never have a research school, because London's the place. So we lived in London. I used to go up to Nottingham once in a while to see Bob, and I used to go and see Jack Fisher about once a month, I suppose, when he'd read my pieces, assuming he hadn't lost them, which he usually had. And so, yes.
And what about Tawney and Bindoff and the other Tudor and Stuart historians of the time? Did you come across them at all?
Yes, I enrolled in a series of graduate research seminars at the Institute of Historical Research. One was in paleography and diplomatic, which is probably designed to put all graduate students off history forever. I didn't stick that for very long. But the other was Tawney, who still had his early modern seminar. This was 54, 55 at the Institute. I also went to Bindoff's as well, but they were very, very different. Bindorf would have his graduate students around him, and it was a sort of question and answer session. And people like me who weren't his students, it was like watching a tennis match, really, you know. But Tony brought everybody in, and that is, there were a lot of American students and students from all over the place, and he took an interest in all of them, very active interest. He'd also bring lots of other people in, scholars from other places. I remember meeting Kindleberger, and so the great and the good, you know, would get off the plane and come in to give a seminar. Tony would puff his pipe and generally spew vegetable matter all over the desk. Now, at the end of the first year, he went to Australia for a year, and he said that's it. He was what? He was well into his 70s by then, and he said that's it. You know, we're not going to have our seminars anymore. So a few of us actually kept them alive in somebody's house. There was a rather extraordinary woman called Mrs. Millard, who'd been a research student for about 35 years, I should think. But we used to hold Tony's seminars in absentia. And we twisted his arm, really, so when he came back from Australia, he took them up again. But I have to say now, really, that you know, he was not at his best. He was beginning to wander a bit. Well, but he was there.
Yeah. And perhaps at the age of 70, it's permissible to wander a bit.
Actually, I mean, one great benefit for me was that when I started applying for jobs, looking for referees, I wrote to Tony and said, would you act as a referee? And he wrote back, and I wish I'd kept the letter, but I didn't. And he said, dear Clarkson, yes, by all means, please write and tell me who you are. So, but he did write a reference for me.
So was that the reference that you needed in order to get your first job in Australia?
Yes. Again, it's not quite as simple as that. David Chambers, you get from the Pat Hudson volume, had a sort of little cottage industry going, sending graduate students to Australia. And he heard that Nottingham wanted a senior tutor, a job which is roughly equivalent to an assistant lecturer in those days. The head of the department at Nottingham was Bill Woodruff, who had been at Nottingham when I was there.
As a head of department in Australia?
Yes, he'd got the chair of economic history. And it must have been through that contact that David Chambers heard that Woodruff was wanting a senior tutor. And he passed the message on to me via Bob Ashton. And so I applied, and so my grant had run out by then. I hadn't quite finished my thesis. And so off we went. My referees were Jack Fisher and Tony. Jack, being Jack, didn't really get round to writing the reference until after I'd arrived. And when it arrived, it wasn't terribly supportive. But on the other hand, Tony's was.
Even though he didn't know who you were?
He didn't know, well, just as well for me, I think. Yeah. So I had one reference from Tony and a rather backhanded one from Fisher. Because Jack had many qualities, but writing letters, or replying to letters quickly, was not one of them, if ever, in fact. So, yes, that's how I got to.
So you spend that short time in Australia, you come back, and then short-term jobs, schoolmaster period in Leicester, was it? And then you went back to Australia to a post in economics, I think.
I went to Melbourne in 1958 to join a Department of Economic History, which was headed by Bill Woodruff. And I stayed there until the end of 1961, when the whole department, except for Professor Woodruff, left. Now, I won't go into details, but that's just to say that we all went our separate ways. My separate way was back to unemployment in England. But again, David Chambers found me a job for just one term at Leicester, where there wasn't very much economic history. There was no department then. It was a little sub-department of economics. But Jim Dios was running it and was really trying to create, what he was doing really was trying to invent urban history, by day and get himself a chair by night. Didn't quite work out like that. He got the chair established, but unfortunately for him, Rolf Davis got it. But he got a personal chair of urban history. Yeah. But that only lasted for a term. While I was there, Bob Ashton offered me a job. You couldn't do this now, could you?
No, not at all. He
offered me a job in Nottingham because he was going to California for a year. So I jumped at it. Yeah, I'm coming. And within a few days, he contacted me and said, look, not sure that I'm going anymore, because he was going for a sabbatical, but he thought he couldn't get money for his wife and child. So he said, don't burn your boats. In the meantime, I had 2 unsolicited offers from Australia. And one was in Western Australia, which was a lectureship in economics, but specialising in economic history. The other was at the ANU, where Noel Butlin, I don't know if you've come across Noel Butlin, was really turning Australian economic history into a sub-branch of econometrics. It was good stuff, but it involved a level of mathematical competence which I didn't think I had, I knew I hadn't. So I accepted the West Australian job. And of course, after I accepted that, and it was all done and dusted, Bob went to California anyway and never came back. So I could have stayed there, I suppose. But anyway, off I went to Western Australia to lecture in economic and social history. Although the head of the department, Ian Bowen, he was the equivalent of their A-level chief examiner in economics, but he delegated it all to me. And I said, but I'm an economic historian. He said, but your title is lecturer in economics. You set the paper, you mark it. He took the money.
Not much changes.
Not much changes.
Indeed. Indeed. But working in the Department of Economics, it did make me wonder. Certainly when I first came to Queen's, there was a perpetual debate, it seemed to me, about whether students of economic history should be made compulsorily to take economics. And I wonder if, on the basis of your experience both in Australia and, of course, subsequently, what your views are on that.
Well, when you first came to Queen's, honours students had to do it.
Yes, I remember it well. It was a great embarrassment to me.
Well, because you hadn't done economics.
I
yes.
had. But I'd only done Frederick Benham, as indeed you did.
Benham, yes.
Anyway.
I had done economics at Nottingham for 2 years. At the time that I started seriously in economic history, the influence of economics, the macro stuff, the long-term growth stuff, the Keynes stuff, was coming through. I had read Rostow's Economic Fluctuations, the 1948 book. Jack Fisher, his famous inaugural lecture on the dark ages of English economic history, used so much of the then current theories about long-term economic development, the changes that you need to get from broadly what we'd call now a pre-industrial society through into industrialization. So without explicitly using much economic theory, he was talking like an economist, but of course in a very elegant fashion. So my view, really from almost the time I graduated, was that economics was an extremely useful tool. And then once you started getting the influence of the American historians or economists, most American economic historians have come up through economics. They have done until very recently. Once you started getting the influence of those, two things happened. First of all, in some ways, the insights of the subject became much more powerful. But on the other hand, for many, many students, the subject began to be more and more difficult to grasp. So I think in an ideal world, what I would like for a student of economic history to do is to read some economics, or if you like, old-fashioned political economy for a year, or possibly 2 years. But I think in the real world, that's not the sort of training they're getting from economics departments. Now, in some ways, this isn't a new thing. After all, you go right back to the disputes between Cunningham and Marshall, and even before that, right back to the 1870s and the 1880s. You've always had this sort of dichotomy. Now, we don't want to revive this old methodological argument, but it would be good, I think, for students to have the kind of long-term overview that some good old-fashioned political economy would give. But economics departments don't, on the whole, do that. They plunge students into, the macro, simple supply and demand. I call it simple, but I know that students who were at the other end of it didn't always regard it as simple. So, if you want the subject to survive, revive possibly is a better word, if you want it to revive in universities, to insist that students do economics as part of it, I think you're just shooting yourself in the foot. So I think you've got to find other ways of getting students into the subject without insisting that they do formal economics. And possibly the same thing goes for statistics as well, because we've come a long, long way from Clapham's statistics, which is simply counting on 5 or 10 fingers and a few averages and a couple of frequency tables. Now, once you go beyond that, even simple correlations, in my experience, and I suspect in yours as well, for most of our students are just too much. But I think, if I go back to Tawny, Tawny's history was suffused with some kind of theoretical concepts, more sociological than economic. Poston, similarly, and what they were doing, I think, was seeing economic changes within the context of the social structures and the political structures. And I think that's probably the way forward, if we could revive Tawny. Do you know you can't get Tawny's Religion and the Rise of Capitalism even on Amazon these days? It seems to me to be a disgrace.
Well, it was certainly one of the influential books that shaped me, but we'll come back to some of those issues in a moment. But let's get you away from Australia, and you turn up in Belfast in the early part of the 1960s. Was that Hobson's choice or a positive decision?
Oh, that was Hobson's choice. I've been in Melbourne, went back to Western Australia, which was all right. But, in total, we'd been there for about 7 years, and there's a choice that you have to make. There were family pressures, not so much on my side, but on Rosalind's side. And if you're one of 10 children, there are parents like dear octopus, pulling you back. But also academically, I have to decide, well, am I going to throw my lot in with perhaps Australian economic history, or do what some people do, that is simply study, say, European economic history, perhaps medieval history, but you simply using theoretical concepts, the sort of thing that Graham Snooks has done for He was one of my students, incidentally. So looking at bits of data and plugging them into economic models, that's one way of going. The other way was doing the empirical stuff, but turning to Australia, or possibly Southeast Asia, which apart from the language difficulty, would have been an attractive way if I've had sufficient forethought. But I thought, no, the UK was a possibility. So I was just looking around for jobs. I applied for Bangor, University Bangor, but Kerridge was in. Kerridge had been in the wilderness for some years for reasons which we don't necessarily have to explore. But he was in for the Bangor job, and Bob Ashton told me he was going to get it. I then applied for York, where there was a job. Bob Ashton again told me that somebody else was in for that, and I wasn't going to get that either. These guys would all fall foul of employment law now. But there was a job going in Belfast, so I didn't even bother to write out an application. I just sent a carbon copy of the one I'd sent to York and just changed it for York Read Belfast. And I didn't hear another word until one very hot day in January 1965. I had a one-sentence letter from the Vice-Chancellor, Michael Grant. He simply said, "Dear Clarkson, I have pleasure in appointing you to a lectureship in economic history at a salary of £1,995 per annum. Yours sincerely." That's all it said. Nothing else. Nothing. Just a single air letter. So
So you're probably not surprised then that when you turn up, Cyril Ehrlich, who is running the ship at the time, mistakes you for an RUC detective come to investigate a robbery.
That's right.
Rather than his new lecturer
That's
in
right.
economic history. And those who know Cyril will not be at all surprised at that.
I came into number 3 College Park East, where the department was until the current Vice-Chancellor decided to knock it down, or the building down, and came up the stairs, knocked at the door, opened it, and he said, "Thank God you've come." Yeah, I've never had such a welcome in my life. But he thought I was a policeman come to investigate the break-in the night before. Then I explained to him that I wasn't. So then we got talking about economic history. I mentioned Geshenkron, and his eyes brightened up. Then he said, "What else are you interested in?" Not quite like that. I foolishly said music. So he started cross-questioning me, and he soon discovered that my knowledge of music was not very great.
Not compared with his.
So I got categorized into one of Cyril's non-musical friends. But I liked. We had a professor of music here called David Marsh, was it?
Oh no, I know.
The one
Greer.
David Greer, yes.
David Greer.
I actually said to David one time, I'm one of Cyril's non-musical friends, and he put out his and he should shake. So am I. Yeah, but we met Cyril. I met Cyril.
But of course, the great figure in Queen's economic history when you arrived was Ken Connell.
Yes.
Perhaps you'd like to say something about your impressions of him as a scholar.
Well, I'd met Ken actually just before we came, because our paths crossed physically, because he was going to Canberra for a year, and we actually met him in Australia just before we left. And I'd come across his work before, but then he came back after in summer, I suppose, of 1966. My physical impression, of course, he's tall, elegant, a man of immense charm and generosity. His scholarship, I think, was very, very fine. It seems to me that he had two influences, both in the area of demography. Obviously in Irish economic history, where I think his population of Ireland before the famine, it's not what 1750, 1850, which was published in 1950, remains one of the seminal books. But 2 or 3 years after that, he published in Irish Historical Review this article, Some Unsettled Problems in English and Irish Demography, where he said on the Irish experience that the English model, which was largely explanations in terms of falling death rates, perhaps should be reconsidered, and the rising fertility for various reasons should be considered instead. Of course, now that's the current orthodoxy, Tony Wrigley and all that. But I mean, that was a path-breaking article, which I think doesn't get the credit it deserves. Now, in Irish history, his significance, I think, is in his demographic and in his social teaching. I mean, the history of mentality. I mean, he didn't publish very much. He's got the population book, and then those 4 essays published in 1968, which are just four very slight essays. Ether drinking. What's the long article on Catholicism and marriage in the 19th century? It's not quite what it's called, and a couple of other things. And I remember Michael Roberts, who was professor of history here in the 60s and 70s, saying it's a book which is much greater than the sum of its parts. And he was, I think, a great scholar. His influence, I think, was very, very limited. In that he wasn't constitutionally or temperamentally the sort of man that would, encourage or develop a school of history. He didn't have young scholars knocking at his door studying. There was one scholar doing a thesis when I first came here, David Fry. I don't know if you've ever met David, but but nothing ever came of him, or of his work, which was on pre-famine famines. And I think just temperamentally, he was not capable of encouraging others. He was very much a loner, was Ken. And then, of course, as you know, he could have periods of intense depression. And when that happened, it was all communication just broke down. Now, and again, since you were there, you will remember that by the late 60s, the early 70s, the department was really riven on what seemed to be a silly dispute. How much Irish economic social history should be taught in the department, which after all was located in a part of Ireland. I think it could have been resolved had the personalities been different, Ken's personality, but also ours, I feel sad about what happened because, though I talked to Jack Fisher about it later, and Jack had known Ken for years and years, had we handled Ken differently, had we handled ourselves differently, would the outcome have been different? And Jack said no. Jack said to me that it's always been a function of Ken's friends ever since they've known him to save Ken from himself. So the relationships broke down. Ken left the department, became an independent research professor, and then within a couple of years he died. It's left a slightly bad taste in my mouth.
Well, it was a great tragedy, obviously.
And the irony was, after Ken died, Irish history actually expanded in a way which Ken would have wanted.
Yeah, and you, of course, also began to develop your own interests in Irish history. I mean, was that, again, a pragmatic thing? Or?
Well, only in the sense that I did a very foolish thing in the early 70s. I published my lecture notes on British economic history. I suppose the Vice-Chancellor now, if he's listening, would say, that's precisely what you're meant to do, publish. But I'd given a course of lectures on early modern English economic history, almost from the first year that I came here, published them in 1971. And when you do that, you suddenly find yourself in front of a class of 150 students and what the hell am I going to tell them which they can't read already? And in those days, students expected to hear something different from lectures. I'm not sure that they do anymore, but in those days. So I floundered around for a wee while, trying to repackage what I'd already said in a slightly different way, but I didn't find it very satisfying. And then, 1975, I think it was, we just needed in the department to do some stuff on early modern, or actually an Ireland before the famine, I think Miriam Daly was going on leave. Max was doing the 19th century stuff. Ken was no longer around. So I didn't know anything about it, but it's never stopped me yet. So I decided to do a course in Irish history. Students were very forgiving, really. Either they didn't know, they knew even less than I did, which was a possibility, or they were just too polite to say so. But over the years, I still don't know any Irish history, but I know bits, but I don't know.
Well, of course, those were in the days when we had a lot of students. I mean, there was I guess a sort of golden age.
Yes, there was.
When economic history was, I remember when I came in '69, we had probably 30 honours students a year between the two faculties.
We did.
And I mean, clearly, what was the attraction of economic history to students, do you think, at that time?
I think we had to inveigle them, poach them almost from other areas. After all, if they'd come up from school, almost all of them had come up through the history route. And school history in Northern Ireland, and I think as far as I know in other parts of the UK as well, didn't have much economic history in them. So they flocked into modern history in large numbers. And you remember the structure of the first year in economics or in arts. It was a 3-subject or a 4-subject first year, and we would often get them as the 3rd or the 4th choice. So in a way, it was just a spillover. It was a timetable filler. There was also a very small number of mature students who had come across the subject, perhaps doing A-levels or similar courses at the Tech. And there'd always been a tradition, at least back to Tawney, and I think possibly earlier, in fact, going back to Arnold Toynbee, of the subjects that appealed to mature students, because it posed a great question. That is the generation of wealth. Now, in Toynbee's day, how could you have great wealth and great poverty? So you had, I think, this extraordinarily important social question. The generation of wealth and what happened to welfare. And did the generation of wealth depend upon private enterprise? Is that lovely sentence, lovely paragraph at the end of Ashton's Industrial Revolution, about the individual rather than the state. Or did it depend upon the state? And if you could look across Europe, to the Soviet Union, where you see a very different way of trying to generate wealth, a command economy, creating things from the top. And similarly with welfare. So I think the time I entered into the subject, which was in the late 40s, early 50s, you had all that enthusiasm of post-war Britain, and the first Labour government, the Attlee government, nationalisation. Now, a lot of that, I think, was still coming through, even in the 60s. After the growth people were at work. Third world problems. We divided the world into the first world, third world. The second world somehow got lost in the middle, never quite sure what it was. But how do you make poor people wealthier? That begged the question, what do you mean by wealth? Is it material wealth, or is it something spiritual or psychological? Are you happy in the countryside, chewing on a straw, watching a cow, chewing on the cud? Or are you happier as a factory worker 5.5 days a week and a football match on Saturday afternoon? Or the late 20th century version, working in an office for 5 days a week, supermarket on Saturday and on Sunday, with television in between. So those seem to me to be the issues that should have attracted students. In other words, economic and social history bore upon their actual life experience, or the experience of their fathers and their grandparents, fathers and mothers and their grandparents. and possibly their great-grandparents. So I think it had that attraction. Now, what didn't it have? It didn't have a job at the end of it. Now, that didn't matter, I think, in the 60s and too much in the early 70s. But it does begin to matter, and by the time you get to the late 70s or the 80s, you get students who are seeking vocational degrees. Now, we've always had them, but they did social work, they did medicine, they did law. Now, for a while, economic history in Queen's was a route to social work. You could do a degree in economic history and go and get a social work training. Can't do that now, unless things have changed since I retired. Or you could do a degree in economic history, then go downtown and get an apprenticeship in the accountant's office and pick up your accounting exams. And the civil service. You and I must know our former graduates around who did this sort of thing and are now in senior positions. But the subject now doesn't lead to directly to a vocational outlet, even an indirect one by doing a degree and then starting at the bottom of a career. So many students now think that they need a vocationally directed degree. And of course, Queen's began to invent degrees which did this. Bachelor of Social Sciences doesn't exist anymore, does it?
No.
You've abolished it, haven't you?
I'm afraid I did, yes.
Yeah, well, good thing too, in a way. But with its economics, with its business studies, with its I've forgotten what they all are. There was politics, of course.
Even sociology.
Even sociology. Politics is an interesting one because I think in Northern Ireland politics became almost a vocational degree. You could read politics and then solve the Northern Ireland problem.
But I suppose coming back to the 60s and 70s, I mean, really what you're saying is that there was almost an ideological element, and students were ideologically aware in the 60s and 70s. I mean,
I think they were.
Anti-Vietnam and all of that.
I think they were.
Yeah. And that was part of the attraction of the subject, certainly.
Yeah.
I mean, part of that surely was the fact that there were so many well-known left-wingers who always, it seemed to me, were the best writers. Now, I'm sure you'll probably disagree with that.
No, I don't.
I mean, Thompson and
E.P.
Savile,
Thompson,
struck me as being superb writers.
Hobsbawm?
Yeah, indeed. Yeah.
Who's still alive, I'm happy to
Yes, yeah.
And writing.
Yeah.
Tawney?
Yeah.
Well, you
Well,
characterised Tawney...
left of a different sort, I think, in
yeah,
Tawney's
yeah,
case. But
yeah.
again, a great writer, I
Yes,
always
indeed.
thought. Yeah. I always thought that had something to do with the attraction, and equally it probably helps to explain, to some extent, why the interest has lapsed.
It goes back, I think, also to my point that the subject has become more technically more demanding.
Yes, yeah.
And it's not impossible, I think, to do the technical stuff and write very well. There are one or two people in Ireland that do it. Cormac O'Grada, I think. He writes beautifully in English, Irish and statistics. Mochia, I think, writes extremely well when he's not doing his sums. Even our colleague Liam, I think, writes quite beautifully.
Yes, he does. Yeah.
But it's more difficult to find those sort of people, I think, in British economic history. I can't really talk about America. I don't know enough about the Americans, except it does seem to me very much a branch of economics. The very good American economic historians all seem to have been.
I mean, does it follow from that, and this comes back to something you said earlier on, I mean, is the subject ever going to recapture its appeal? I mean, it's very largely disappeared anyway as a discipline in terms of having a separate entity within institutions.
I think a subject that explains how societies work, or how the societies in which we live have come to be what they are subjects that have appeal. Now, I know in a way this is an argument for classics, for Latin and Greek, but it's also an argument for the humanities in general, because if you study literature, you study philosophy, if you studied politics, you're getting an insight into the values that shape the society in which you live. And it does seem to me to be an essential function of universities, if you like, to transmit the common culture, to guard it. Peter Froggatt made a point in a paper that he wrote. It was an address he gave to school teachers back in the 1970s, that we think of universities as radical places which upset the temple, turn over the money changers, drive them out. They're not. They're guardians. They're guardians of the temples. And history does that. At least it should do. Well, all history does that. And universities should do that. Now, I think today they have very great difficulty in doing it because you have, the funding arrangements, particularly. I don't know what the figures are now, but at one time, 80%, 90% of Queen's funding came from the block grant, essentially on student numbers. At the end of the 90s, I think it was about half. In other words, you've got to go deviling around for your money. That means chasing research grants. That means doing research, the sort of research that attracts the research grants. Universities have to do that. There's a gearing. The more research grants you get in, the better your staff. Up you go on the league tables. The vice-chancellors all clamour for you to do that. There can't be a vice-chancellor in post these days that hasn't been brought up in this culture. Can't be. Unless they're all over 65, and I shouldn't think there are any of those now. So the whole philosophy of universities in the UK, I think, has changed. The funding has changed, and the funding drives universities into being research-based universities and doing the sort of research that attracts the money. Now, it seems to me that for a lecturer who wants to step back and encourage the study of the common culture, doing the reflective work, is in a bind, because does he fit into the does she fit into the cluster, or do they stand outside? If they spend time reflecting on their subject, talking to students, assuming that they have any that want to be talked to, are they using research time so that we can get our fives and our 5 stars? I think the whole, and you've got 2 other problems too. Well, one particular problem, but you've got the problem of what, as far as I know, is still the RAE. Does it still exist? It does. You see, that again, that reinforces the drive for research and good quality research. And one of the measures of research, of course, is the number of research grants and the size of the research grants you pull in. Then you've got all the teaching quality. That's changed in various ways now, but I call it TQA. Does it exist? It doesn't.
QAA.
QAA. And what does that do? That sets a baseline, as far as I can tell, of student satisfaction. Now, I think I've written somewhere that in my extreme old age, I can say that the function of a university teacher is to confuse his students. Make them go and think for themselves. That guy's talking crap. Okay, to use a John Prescott word. That guy's talking rubbish. What on earth is he on about? Let's go and find out for myself. Now, okay, you can put it more politely. The aim is to stimulate. David Chambers used to do this. I don't think I ever learnt much hard fact economic history from David Chambers. I did that in my own time. But he got you running. Now, I'm not sure that the university teacher who takes that view, my view, is going to get very far. I talked to my grandson, who's at Dundee, the lecture notes come off the web. Do they buy books? Well, I know the nurses do, because they get paid to buy them. But do students generally buy books? The photocopiers are red hot. They read little snippets. it's very difficult, it seems to me, for universities to be what they once were in the 60s and the 70s. Now, you may say that they shouldn't be like that anymore. After all, with 50% of the age cohort going to universities, they shouldn't be like that. They should be organisations turning out high-grade artificers, middle-grade civil servants. So what happens to the guardian of the culture kind of university?
So economic history hasn't got much of a future in this unbrave new world then?
I think its future, well, yes, I think it does, but I think it's a long-term future. I cannot see the current UK university system holding. Now, it might hold for the next 10 or 20 years, but I cannot see it holding. If it, at the same time, wants to maintain its international position, I don't know if you read Mary Warnock's article in The Observer on Sunday. She was saying much the same thing, but I hadn't really written it down. The current structure of university funding seems to me to be, in the long term, unviable unless you want the system to change totally. Now, it might change. I'm sufficiently optimistic to hope that it will come back to kind of somewhat closer to a Newmanite vision of a university. We'll get back to Newman eventually.
You do, and it's greatly influenced my own thinking as well, I have to say. I mean, obviously one of the things that happened as your own career developed within Queen's, and senior lectureship, personal chair, dean of the faculty, finished up as Pro-Vice Chancellor, but I mean all of that was conducted against a background of not only the decline of the subject, certainly in the last 15 or 20 years, but the civil situation in Northern Ireland. I wonder from point of view as your point of view as a senior manager, how you reflect on that and the way that the local circumstances affected the university.
I became Dean of the then faculty in 1986. I became Pro-Vice Chancellor in 1990 until 1995, and then again in 97, 98. That was when there was an acute shortage of Pro-Vice Chancellors. You know, one of them went off to be President of a country because it was easier than being a Pro-Vice Chancellor. Another was acting Vice Chancellor, and a third one was acting Secretary of Academic Council. So I got pulled back, although I have to say that I didn't resist. Now, I should say, I became Dean and then Pro-Vice Chancellor. At the time, well, the troubles had been boiling over, been bubbling for 15 years. But about the time I got involved, Queen's became mired, if you like. It was, there had been a problem since the late 60s, 70s, about what stance the university should make vis-a-vis the Troubles. And I think very wisely people like Arthur Vick and Peter Shroggett says the university as an institution must stand aside. As individuals, yes. But we have a responsibility to our students, from whatever political background they come from, whatever their religious background, to take them in and to teach them to their best of our ability. And I think we did that, but it was very difficult because, I mean, recruitment of staff was difficult, senior staff particularly. But I can remember a number of occasions when senior staff were appointed one week and left the next week. There was a famous case, the Professor of Celtic was appointed from Dublin. He attended his first meeting of Academic Council, and the next week he was away because he'd got death threats. I met him about a year ago in Dublin. He's in the Institute of Advanced Studies. He told me a lot about it, which I hadn't known. So it was difficult to retain good staff. It was difficult to attract new staff. And I think we did our best. Now, what was happening, I think, by the end of the 80s was, first of all, there was all the arguments about fair employment and whether the university was discriminating in the appointment of staff. And it was not handled well, and the way that it was handled simply made a rather bad case worse. And Queen's was getting an enormous amount of hostile criticism, even from areas where you would think that, you know, the local press, for example, would be on our side. The newsletter was very supportive, but I mean, that was like, if the best friend that you have is a newsletter, you're probably in trouble. The Belfast Telegraph was trying to be fair-minded, but of course, the nationalist press and most of the UK press outside Northern Ireland was very hostile to Queen's, because they had a perception that we were discriminating against Catholics on the staff. Now, it was not, I say it was not true. There were probably some areas where there was a germ of truth in it. But that was handled very badly. And then, of course, one way of trying to solve the problem was to make various concessions. And of course, we got into the position of the national anthem crisis, not playing the national anthem at graduations. Now, if you look back now, 10, 15 years when it happened, you say, what was all the fuss about? You know, like next week we should look back about Pakistan and the cricket ball and say, what was all the fuss about?
We hope.
We hope. But it was a terribly important one at the time. And I sat through a number of Senate debates where the anguish and people were saying, rightly, this was the most serious crisis that had occurred in the history of the university. Now, we got through that eventually, not very well, but we muddled through. The fact that the Troubles were dying down anyway helped. But what it really did for me was to make me think hard about the relationship between a university and the society in which it's located. Now, and that means what sort of values should we be teaching? Should we take part as an institution in the political changes, or should we be sensitive to them and adjust as we go along? To what extent should we take a lead? And how can and what should we be teaching students? What sort of research should we be doing in a time of political turmoil? Queen's was unique, I think, in the history of British UK universities, certainly in recent decades. And being a university which was affected by civil strife. Now you might say, what about the University of Ulster? Didn't matter, because they had no historical baggage. After all, Queen's had been established in 1845 as part of the Queen's University in Ireland to solve an educational sectarian problem. How to provide a university education for people who won't qualify to go to Trinity because of their religion. Didn't work. The Royal University in 1880 was a compromise. Didn't work. Now, what you get in 1908, of course, is an independent Queen's University to satisfy the needs of the north of Ireland. Not Northern Ireland, because it didn't exist, but the north of Ireland. And what that meant in practice was a Presbyterian university for Presbyterian people. Now, there was no religious bar on students coming in, on appointments. So that was never a problem. But Queen's was part of what became the state of Northern Ireland. You know, and after 1920, it was as much a part of the institutions of the state as Stormont or the shipyards. And that really makes you think about what the relationship of a university to its society is.
Well, Leslie, you've talked there about what was happening towards the end of your career, and obviously now you've reached the time of life when you're entitled to reflect not exactly to become a grumpy old man, but certainly to reflect. I mean, of all the things that you did as an economic historian, as opposed to managing the university, what's given you the most satisfaction? Which piece of work are you most pleased with?
Well, I think really the work that I did when I moved into Irish economic history. And I was quite pleased with the pre-industrial book, but there are others in the market there, and in that book owed very much to Jack Fisher's ideas. In a way it was a book he didn't write. But when I moved into Irish economic history, I had an interest in demography, and of course Ken Connell's Irish history, in a sense, is demographic history. That's a simplification, but that's what it is in a way. So I really started on the demographic side. And I did a few things on that. But I suppose there are two books which give me the greatest satisfaction. One is the Feast and Famine book that I did with Margaret, and that took 20 years. Well, fun actually. As Pro-Vice Chancellor, telling colleagues, publish 5 pieces a year, or 2 pieces a year, and we take 20 years to produce a book.
I know the feeling.
But I think it's a good book. It owes an awful lot to Margaret's technical skills, and to the fact that she was doing a lot of the work when I was busy failing to run the university properly. But I think that is an important book. It's not a seminal book, I don't do seminal history. Probably about 3 historians a decade or a century do seminal history, and I'm not one of them. But I am very pleased with that book. The other, again, is something that I did with Margaret, and that's a little book on the castes of Armagh, Ways to Wealth, which is a study of a little macro study of a family in Armagh at the end of the 18th century. Now, in a way, the two ends of a spectrum. One's a little local study, although I hope it looks out, and the other is. Well, it's a study of Ireland. I was about to say it was a major study of Ireland, but it's a study of Ireland, but which uses techniques, some of which we borrowed from other disciplines or copied from other areas. But I think it is beginning to get into the beginning to get into the literature. So I am pleased with those. Then there was well, I did a book for you, didn't I?
You did half a book, I think.
No.
No, you. Oh, yes.
I did one chapter.
Death, Disease, and Famine.
Yeah.
I think, yes.
I think it was fun actually. It went down surprisingly well. And he did it because he really needed the money, but still, No, I mean, but that was a piece of synthesis. And so was the pre-industrial book. But no academic these days who wants a career can afford to spend time on writing synthetic books, not regarded as scholarship, particularly by those people who never tried to do one. I mean, you've done them, so you know the problem. There was the Mapping the Great Famine book. It's all right. It caused a lot of grief.
Is there a great work which you always felt you had in you which you never did or haven't done yet?
I hope the latter might be true, because give me an incentive to live for the next 25 years till I can find it. No, I think the Feast and Famine book and the Cusp are the two that I'm most happy with. So the one which I enjoyed doing in a way, but I'm not happy with the outcome, not with the physical product, was the History of Queens. I'm happy with the interpretation. I'm appalled with by the typesetting. I'm embarrassed by it. At least I was when I came, but you grow out of these things. Because it was my attempt really to explain Queens in society. In a way, it looks a bit old-fashioned now, you know, because some of the events which seemed to be so important 10 years ago don't seem to matter very much anymore. I sometimes have a feeling, a belief that I might be able to write a useful synthetic book about Ireland post 1600, but I'm not sure. I'm not sure. And I look around at all the good historians, people like Louis Cullen, you know, who's really carved the market out of synthetic market. I'm not sure. So for the moment, I'm happy doing. I'm doing a little study of Fork Hill in South County Armagh at the moment, which is a little minuscule thing, a bit like the Armagh, the Armagh town stuff, or the Clarkson Shore stuff I did some years ago. So I'm doing that. No, perhaps I'm getting too old to have a great magnum opus. I can think about it. Think about it. Have you got one?
No, absolutely not. No. I want to switch tack now. We're coming towards the end, but I want to switch tack because you were for a long time quite intimately involved in the Economic History Society and the Council.
Yes.
And my impression of that body as a young academic, and certainly for some years after my youth faded, was that it was very much a closed shop, a bit of a triangle between the LSE and Oxbridge. And it was only recently that younger scholars really felt they could break their way into that and perhaps break down that group of friends who seemed to dominate it. I mean, well, you've said it was. I mean, would you like to elaborate on that in any way and tell us about the society and how it worked, or didn't?
Well, when the first meeting that I went to, well, the first one I should have gone to was the one in Belfast in 1960s. It's the one in Manchester in 1966, but I had to pull out at the last minute because Jane was very ill. So the first one I actually went to was one in Belfast in 1967, and it was dominated by the people that had broadly dominated the society in its even before the war, and certainly through the 1940s. And as you say, it was very much a London, Oxbridge setup. The president was Eleanor Carus Wilson, who ran it like a girls' public high school. I think actually Frank Birrell was probably the secretary first then, but Theo Barker very soon was the secretary, secretary, and remained the secretary for 15, 20 years. Peter Mathias was the treasurer for a similar length of time. The editors were the great and the good. Not Tawney then, I think Poston at one stage. And even when Poston was no longer the editor, he behaved as though he was. Yes, it was a very closed shop. And the council was like a little oligarchy. It just elected itself every year. That changed. I've forgotten when, but when the women had a revolution, do you remember? Nestle Hart gives an account of it in the Hudson book. And then it was opened up in various ways, but it was a very Oxbridge-dominated society, and if the original founders weren't there, and some of them still were, then their immediate successors were there. So there was Fisher, who is worthy successor of Tawney. And it had its advantages, because you could hear and see the great men. I met Heaton. 1912, Heaton.
But had it not been like that, do you think that we would have seen the fragmentation? I mean, the labour historians break off, the business historians, the social historians, the urban historians, they all form their own societies and conferences, and I wonder if that fragmentation would have happened had the society been different.
I think it would. I think it would. It's partly, I think, the function of a subject which was simply expanding, and it could afford these little outlying colonies. Now, some of them actually tended to take over the motherland, as it were. So I think, and also as economic history became more technical, then the labour history, the social history, the urban history, the agricultural history tended to become refuge for the people that weren't quite technical enough. But then, of course, the technical people retaliate by setting up quantitative history sections or econometric studies. So I think the fragmentation was partly simply a reflection of the growth of the subject and enthusiasms. I mean, we could have enthusiasms in the 60s and the 70s. You might remember one or two which didn't succeed. Industrial archaeology. Gone. As far as I know, it's gone. I remember Jack Fisher saying he's a nice man until he got religion. I said, what religion was that? He said industrial archaeology, but it'll pass. The two breakaways, I think, which have been extremely important and have remained, historical demography, but I would say that, wouldn't I? Women's history. Now, I think in the early days, women's history was all over the place. You know, it was all crusading, but I think it's settled down now. Good scholars, and I think it's changed the perspective of the subject in many ways. And economic history is really rather good at accommodating it. After all, if you think about demography, you know, half your subject matter must be female. But there was so much area of economic history. Think of labour conditions, factory conditions in the 19th century. With a slight difference of focus, it could accommodate women's history, and I think it has done very well. So if I wanted to be optimistic, I think the subject, if it could, well, it will, I mean, continue on the women's history side, and in a somewhat different way, the historical demography, that does require a certain amount of statistical competence. But I think they are two areas that have survived. They could be brought back into the broad church of economic and social history. I think, well, I haven't been to the society for a few years now, but I think the society will survive on that way. But going back to your original question, I think the fragmentation would have come even had the society not have been such a close shop.
Right. We began by saying that being an economic historian wasn't a particularly rational choice to make, given your starting point. Now, I know you've always said to me that if you'd been able to choose an alternative career, it would have been to open the batting for England.
That's true, yeah.
But having run you out in that infamous cricket match several years ago, I think we both agreed it was never likely to be a very feasible option. But in general, looking back, any regrets?
None whatsoever. It's been a very satisfying career. And even now, when I talk to academic colleagues who seem to be so dissatisfied for one reason or another about their pay, about their working conditions, it's still, to be an academic, I think, is still the best career that I could possibly think of. When I went to Nottingham aged 18, in 1951, I had one overriding belief: I never wanted to leave university again. Now, there was a time temporarily when I was out of it, but I never really wanted to. It seemed to be great. I couldn't really have articulated the reason why, but I think it's just the world of scholarship, of ideas, meeting nice people, Most people were nice. I think of one or two that probably weren't. People, on the whole, that are not amenable to, to great control. University is really like a collection of cats rather than dogs or sheep. Perhaps it's one of the problems now. Universities are now trying to be turned into sheep pens, so you all go through. Where it's really a community of cats. They want to go their way. They want to find. This seems to me to be great. And somebody that has paid me for 40 years to study history. They're either mad, and it's great. It's great. My mother said to me when I wanted to be a historian, "There's no future in history." Well, I think in a philosophical sense she was probably wrong, but in her everyday sense she was right. But there was. Whether I could have made more money outside universities, I don't know. I doubt it.
Well, that's a counterfactual which we're not going to set as a PhD topic for some student. But Leslie, thank you very much.
Pleasure. Thanks very much.